7-year vegan to 100% carnivore. Check out this review from Julia S. I've been vegan since my freshman year of high school. Being a 2-time state champ and D1 track athlete, I only powered my body with plants. I felt like I was at 70% of my best all the time. Hearing of Paul's work and the Heart and Soil supplements, I knew it was time to treat my body better and give it what it needs to perform at 100%. I purchased beef organs and fire starters to start off with almost a month in, and I feel like a completely new and improved athlete with an even better body composition. My performance has improved, my energy levels have skyrocketed, and my training felt easier. Seeing all these improvements, I will definitely be telling my teammates and buying more supplements. Thank you, Paul, and the Heart and Soil team. 100% carnivore now from a vegan. One of the things that I think is so fascinating is that when vegans say, hey, look, I'm a vegan, I'm a plant-based dieter, and I'm performing fine, I always wonder, how much better could you be if you had the most nutritious foods on the planet, if you had animal foods in your diet and in your life? And with that in mind, we see this over and over. When athletes add back things like beef organ supplement from Heart and Soil, liver, heart, pancreas, meat, they perform even better. So get organs in your diet, no matter how you do it. If you get them fresh, fantastic. If you get them desiccated, check us out, heartandsoil.co. That's heartandsoil.co to reclaim your birthright to radical health. And we make grass-fed, grass-finished, regeneratively raised supplements, the finest on the planet from New Zealand. And I know they're going to change your life, just like they did with Julia. That's so cool. That review really made my day when I read it. If you guys are watching on YouTube, you know that this is yet another shirtless introduction to a podcast. I thought, oh, well, why not? I do the podcast with a shirt on, whether you like that or not. Who knows whether that goes in which direction for you. But there have been a lot of interesting podcasts recently on fructose and uric acid. And there's a recent book about lowering uric acid that people have sent me. And so I wanted to try and do my best to connect the dots here and highlight some of the aspects of these conversations that may not have been highlighted properly or enough, in my opinion. I think that doing this research was really fun. It was a really interesting way to do this, to connect the dots, to see if I could help people understand the nuance here. And though this podcast is difficult to kind of string together for me and may have been a little bit rambling, and I apologize for that at times, I think there's a lot of interesting information here, and you will definitely learn something in your knowledge of fructose, absorption in the small intestine, why fructose is harmful, when fructose is not harmful, uric acid when it's beneficial, what's going on with that will, I think, be increased significantly. And what we come away with is a really interesting idea that fruit is probably just fine for humans. Why are we not surprised? But it's interesting to see it in the literature, including interventional studies showing that fruit is just fine for humans. So enjoy this podcast with yours truly. Again, I've been enjoying doing these monocast, solocast, monologue podcasts. If you guys have more questions, you can always reach out to me in the DMs on Instagram. If you like this podcast, please, please, please. Shirtless Paul is entreating. I'm just asking you from the bottom of my heart. This is an entreaty. Leave me a review. Apple Podcasts, Spotify. It helps us spread the message. There's so many people that need to benefit from this message. It's very simple. Meat, organs, fruit, honey, raw dairy, eliminate seed oils, processed sugars. People thrive. I see it over and over. I'm always learning. I'm always evolving. I never want to be calcified or ossified or fossilized. I'm not going to sacrifice curiosity and wisdom for the sake of consistency. That would be dogma. But I really feel that these conversations will be valuable for many humans on the planet. Thank you for leaving me a review and helping me reach more of those humans. On to this podcast. Enjoy this one. Let me know what you think, guys. Hey, guys, before we jump into this week's podcast, I just wanted to apologize. I'm hearing the day before the podcast is going to release from my audio editors that I messed something up in the recording, and the audio in the podcast is not great. It's listenable, but it's not great. I use Rodecaster Pro. I don't know what I did or how I messed it up, but I apologize in advance. The audio on this week's podcast is lower quality than normal, but we got it fixed for next week. Hopefully you will still appreciate the nuggets of information that I tried to convey in this podcast. And so we'll move on from there, but please accept my apologies on the audio. And I hope it doesn't completely take away from the value of this one. What is up, truth seekers? Welcome to another edition of the Fundamental Health Podcast. I wanted to start this week's edition with a study about red meat and longevity. This is an observational study, but it's interesting and fascinating nonetheless. The title is Total Meat Intake is Associated with Life Expectancy. a cross-sectional data analysis of 175 contemporary populations. Again, this is observational. It's an association-based study. They looked at 175 countries, and they found that worldwide bivariate correlation analyses revealed that meat intake is positively correlated with life expectancies. This relationship remains significant when influences of caloric intake, urbanization, obesity, education, and carbohydrate crops were statistically controlled. Stepwise linear regression selected meat intake, not carbohydrate crops, as one of the significant positive predictors of life expectancies. In contrast, carbohydrate crops, wheat, corn, things like that, showed weak and negative correlation with life expectancy. Let's break this one down a little bit. It was published on the 22nd of February. It was submitted late last year. It's observational, so we can't draw causative inference. But let's talk about why epidemiology is a little bit limited and when we can actually use this to generate a hypothesis that is reasonable. There's a lot of talk right now about meat being bad for longevity. And I simply do not believe that there's good evidence to back this up. I think there's some mechanistic data there, but I think that in general, the arguments that meat is affecting longevity negatively are pretty darn weak. Even in the beginning of this study, even in their introduction, they say the association between a plant-based diet, they call it vegetarianism, and extended lifespan is increasingly criticized since it may be based on the lack of representative data and insufficient removal of confounders such as lifestyles. So one of the things I've talked about many times in the past is that oftentimes over the last 70 years, people who eat plant-based diets are doing more healthy behaviors. And these observational epidemiology researchers are faced with the task of teasing out whether it's these healthy behaviors that are causing improvements in lifespan or the absence of meat or the presence of vegetables. Epidemiology, observational research really isn't good at showing that. I've shown Asian studies in a completely different culture, a completely different paradigm that associates meat with affluence, showing that the people who eat the most meat have the lowest rates of breast cancer in the case of women and the lowest rates of heart attacks in the case of men. So in that situation, you're saying, okay, how do we account for that? How is it possible that meat in the United States is associated with negative outcomes, and then in Asia, it's associated with positive outcomes? Probably because what we're seeing with these observational studies is more about lifestyle and associated confounding variables than it is about the meat or the vegetables. This is an interesting study because it's about 175 different contemporary populations, and it really flies in the face of the in vogue narrative that meat is going to shorten your life. There's so many people saying this now, and it is asking us to really question this notion and says, hey, look, meat is associated with a longer life in these populations, and they're doing their best to control for lifestyle factors. Again, no study is perfect. This study could also be confounded by bias. So let's talk about it. There are two types of bias that I've discussed in the past: healthy user bias and unhealthy user bias. And healthy user bias is when people are doing good activities, and unhealthy user bias is when people are doing bad activities and associating that with the meat. But across 175 contemporary populations, I think that's very interesting because it's not going to see a consistent healthy user bias or unhealthy user bias. And this study is quite compelling because it suggests, hey, look, meat is associated with more longevity. Why are we not surprised? The nutrients in meat and organs are unique. They're going to let you live longer because all of your cells, all of your biochemistry is going to function better. So again, this is not causative. We cannot draw causative inference, but it begins to question, continues to poke holes, continues to suggest that the facade is crumbling regarding the notion that a plant-based diet is associated with longevity, and continues to suggest that meat and organs are essential for the human diet and essential for longevity, and that all of this discussion about mTOR and stuff is really, I would say, missing the forest for the trees. I'll add this. You guys can listen to a podcast I did a few weeks back where I reposted a previous conversation with David Sinclair. I haven't been able to get it back on the podcast to debate some of this stuff in a friendly manner. He's pretty busy right now, according to what I hear, so we'll keep working on it. But in that conversation, you heard me challenge him a little bit. Since thinking about that conversation, I've dove a little more into mTOR, and I've learned things like when you do intermittent fasting, if you do an 8-hour window or a 6-hour window, there's more mTOR after you're fasting. In your fasting window, there's more mTOR. Okay, so fasting is going to increase mTOR. All right, tell me mTOR is bad for you now. And things like sauna can increase mTOR. Things like cold plunges can increase mTOR. And both the sauna and the cold plunge can increase longevity genes, sirtuins. So I think that this notion that mTOR is a bad thing and that you never want to You never want to increase it. You really want to minimize it. You want to eat a low leucine diet because it's going to increase mTOR. It doesn't make sense when you look at all these equations and you look at all these things that trigger mTOR. Exercise triggers mTOR. Breath holding can trigger mTOR. If you're doing apnea therapy or if you're doing free diving, that can trigger mTOR. A lot of things trigger mTOR. Sauna's triggering mTOR. All these things that we really believe are good for us look like mTOR is not necessarily the unanimously voted villain that it has been made out to be. So with all of that said, I want to dive into the, I'm going to say meat of this podcast and talk about fructose and uric acid. Hat tip to Peter Attia and Rick Johnson. I've been listening to their recent podcasts and kind of breaking this down. And I wanted to connect some of the dots that I think might have been left unconnected in their recent podcasts. Within the popular nutrition literature, there is this notion promulgated that animals eat fruit to get fat. This concept came up a lot in the podcast between Peter and Rick. And it starts to make a little intuitive sense. Why wouldn't the same be for humans? We have this uricase mutation after all, which I'll go into a little later in the podcast. Fruit makes humans fat. But when I look at my results and look at my friends' results, and I look at the results of thousands of people who are eating an animal-based diet of organs, meat, fruit, honey, and raw dairy, I see a lot of foods that are high in fructose. Okay. I see honey and I see fruit, which are significantly going to contribute to the overall fructose load in the human diet. But I see people losing weight. I see people staying lean. I stay very lean. Is it my genetics, or is it the fact that fructose in fruit is not the same as fructose in isolation, something I've talked about in the past? But almost invariably, when people go on an animal-based diet, they may increase or maintain their fructose consumption and they lose weight. So how is it exactly that fruit is making humans fat? I don't think that observationally I see evidence for that. So that begins to make me question this assumption and begins to make me look a little more deeply at this research. One of the papers that was cited in these recent podcasts is with orangutans. And I want to show you guys this. This is really quite fascinating. The title is Changes in Orangutan Caloric Intake, Energy Balance, and Ketones in Response to Fluctuating Fruit Availability. This is from Cheryl Knott. It's from 1997. I think it was published in 1998. Now, remember, humans are not descended from orangutans directly. It's chimps and bonobos that are our common ancestors, but orangutans are primates, and so perhaps there's some homology here. Perhaps there's something we can learn. So what Cheryl noticed is that in this part of Gunung Pulang National Park, West Kalimantan, Indonesia, from September 1994 through September 1995, she observed greater than 60 orangutans in these parks. And there was a mass fruiting that occurred, resulting in large fluctuations in fruit availability, measured by monitoring 558 orangutan fruit trees. She says the orangutan diet varied tremendously in accordance with the fluctuations. During the month of the highest fruit production, 100% of the orangutan diet was composed of fruit. They were fruitarians. In contrast, during the fruit poor period, as little as 21% of the diet was fruit, while 37% was bark. Aren't you glad you're not an orangutan? I don't know who wants to eat bark. Now, what they find here is that during the month of the highest fruit consumption, which is January, male orangutans consumed 8,422 calories a day, and females 7,404 calories per day from fruit. From fruit versus 3,824 and 1,793 for males and females, respectively, in the lowest fruit months. Now, is it surprising that orangutans consuming 7,000 to 8,000 calories of pure fruit became fat? Maybe, maybe not. Let's think about this. I think that the key distinguishing piece here is how much fruit is too much. And why do I ask that in the first place? Because of this mechanism that I'm going to show you. There's a really interesting paper by Matt Kaberlein showing that when they do gastric gavage, so actually infusing fructose into the small intestine of model animals, they find that the intestine is actually able to metabolize most of that fructose into non-fructose intermediates, glycerate, lactate, and glucose, up until the point where they're giving 1 gram of fructose per kilogram of body weight. So that's a pretty high level. I'm going to show you guys this paper. And I think that this is a really relevant place to start this discussion. The small intestine converts dietary fructose into glucose and organic acids. So they say here, excessive consumption of sweets, risk factor for metabolic syndrome. I would agree with that. A major chemical feature of sweets is fructose, okay? Despite strong ties between fructose and disease, the metabolic fate of fructose in mammals remains incompletely understood. Okay, if you listen to the mainstream media or mainstream nutritional pundits, that is not clear. The admission that we don't fully understand what happens to fructose. So they used isotope tracing and mass spec to track the fate of glucose and fructose in vivo, finding that dietary fructose is cleared by the small intestine. So when you eat food, it goes into your mouth, down your esophagus, into your stomach, and then it goes into the small intestine, which is divided into three main parts, the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. Then the ileum moves into the colon through the ileocecal valve. They say here, clearance requires the fructose phosphorylating enzyme ketohexokinase, also known as fructokinase. And they say low doses of fructose are 90% cleared by the intestine with only trace fructose, but extensive fructose-derived glucose, lactate, and glycerate found in the portal blood. That's the blood moving from the intestines to the liver through the superior mesenteric vein, etc. High doses of fructose, greater than 1 gram per kilogram, overwhelm intestinal fructose absorption and clearance, resulting in fructose reaching both the liver and the colonic microbiota. Intestinal fructose clearance is augmented by both prior exposure to fructose and by feeding. So that is a very important point as well, that when you are exposed to fructose in your diet, that is, if your ancestors were eating fruit, their bodies could upregulate the mechanisms in the intestine that were dealing with the fructose, okay? And by feeding in general, that will increase our ability to deal with fructose. How much do I weigh? 165 pounds, and perhaps, let's see, 75 kilograms, 76 kilograms. The equivalent for me would be 76 grams of fructose in a meal. I don't get anywhere near that. Let's think about how much fructose carnivore MD eats in a meal. I probably eat 2 meals a day with fruit, and they have half a papaya, 2 bananas, and maybe half of a moderate pineapple, which I cut up. Maybe it's a cup of pineapple and a cup, maybe a tablespoon, and maybe a tablespoon of honey. So I think if you look at that, many would say that's a large fructose load, Paul. That's too much fructose. But that's still going to put me in the realm of maybe 35 or 40 grams of fructose, well below this threshold, according to this study at least, of 1 gram per kilogram of fructose to overwhelm what the small intestine can do. And physiologically, I assume or I believe that what is happening is what I view exteriorly, which is that I am not becoming insulin resistant based on my labs. I'm not becoming obese. I don't have fatty liver based on everything I can tell in my blood work, et cetera. And this fructose is not getting to my liver or overwhelming the mechanisms there. As I'll show you guys later, my uric acid eating this way also doesn't rise. There's been a lot of talk about uric acid recently and fear-based conversations about the fact that you need to lower your uric acid. Yeah, you should lower your uric acid, but it's important to realize that the mainstream narrative around uric acid is flawed and incomplete, and we'll get into that. In a metabolically healthy individual like myself, caveat aside, how do you know if you're metabolically healthy? Wear a continuous glucose monitor from a company like NutriSense, or getting fasting insulin, which is probably the preferred, easier way to do it. It is 5 micro-IU per ml. That is your target. If you are less than 5 micro-IU per ml, you are insulin sensitive by my estimation. If you are more than that, then you really need to begin looking at what is causing some degree of insulin resistance in your body. My fasting insulin is usually 3 or less, with a C-peptide to correlate with that of less than 0.5. I'll show you guys those labs in a little bit. And for what it's worth, my uric acid has been 4.6 or less than that when I've added back in fruit and honey. I did a number of uric acid tests when I was purely carnivore. Then I moved into adding fruit and honey. Why did I do that? Because I developed muscle cramps, I developed heart palpitations, signs and symptoms of pretty significant electrolyte abnormalities. And I realized, okay, I need to add back carbohydrates to my diet. I've spoken about this in previous podcasts. There's good evidence that at the level of the kidney, some action of insulin is necessary. Phasic insulin is good. I think it's good to have an insulin spike after a meal. If you're insulin sensitive, your insulin will quickly return to normal. Your fasting insulin will remain less than 5, or in my case, less than 3, and you will not be insulin resistant. You will remain insulin sensitive, and that insulin will be active in your tissues, moving glucose where it's supposed to. And that is a good thing. That insulin spike is very valuable at the level of the kidney to maintain your electrolytes. If you talk to people in the ketogenic community, who I appreciate, who I love, but who probably don't like me very much anymore because I eat fruit and honey, you'll invariably find them eating massive amounts of sodium and salt because they can't maintain their electrolytes because their insulin is chronically very low. That is great if you are insulin resistant from the beginning, and we can talk about where low carb diets are applicable and why they're beneficial. But in general, I think that you want to have a phasic spike of insulin in your diet with some honey, with some fruit. That's not going to cause insulin resistance, but it's going to allow you to retain and maintain electrolyte balance in your body. And I found that personally, and I've seen that over and over from people that I work with and DMs on Instagram, et cetera. When people message me and they say, I'm doing carnivore and I'm having XYZ, I don't even really have to look at what they're saying. I just say, add carbohydrates. And they say, what sources of carbohydrates? And I say, fruit, the least toxic source of carbohydrates. Why am I a fan of fruit? Because it's the sweet part of the plant. It's the part that the plant actually wants you to eat. It's colorful. It's clear the plant wants you to eat this, and that humans always seek this. The Hadza always seek fruit when it's available. They'll always eat honey when it's available. If you guys follow my buddy Liver King, Brian Johnson, you saw that he was recently in Tanzania with the Hadza, the same tribe that I visited last year, and he was sticking his hand into a tree to get honey, and then they were all just celebrating the fact they were eating this honey. The Hadza don't fear honey. It doesn't make them insulin resistant. It didn't make me insulin resistant. It won't make you insulin resistant because that fructose is different, and I've talked about this at length, but we'll unpack it a little more as we go on in this podcast. Going back to the original point and this paper from Matt Kaberlein, Joshua Rabinowitz, not Matt Kaberlein. You can see here they have a graphic, low dose fructose versus high dose fructose, how much spills over into the liver versus in the portal circulation and the microbiota versus how much is metabolized in the small intestine. That is a very interesting mechanism by which the small intestine could absolutely be protecting us and or just metabolizing the fructose as it's supposed to, right? And like I said, they use isotopic tracers and metabolomics. They use mass spec as well. Now, if you go down in this paper, you'll see that the highest expression of this enzyme, ketohexokinase, is in the liver, suggesting that the liver is the key site of fructose catabolism. But we know now that the small intestine is a key piece of this as well. Further on in this paper, they do note that there are questions about how does fructose cause fatty liver. One possibility is that the small intestine converts fructose into a hepatotoxic metabolite. I think that's probably less likely. For example, the microbiota makes butyrate, intestine makes copious amounts of glycerate from fructose, but not glucose. Is it possible that's leading to triglycerides? Maybe. I think it's more likely that fructose may induce liver toxicity via itself reaching the liver. This is, I think, what Rick Johnson would suggest, is that when there's too much fructose in the circulation and it reaches the liver, that fructose gets metabolized in the liver via the enzymes there. That process doesn't have brakes on it like glucose metabolism does, leading to ATP consumption. When you must phosphorylate fructose with phosphofructokinase, you use up ATP, use up that phosphate group. That becomes ADP, and that ADP can accumulate and lead to AMP through the action of enzyme systems in the liver. I'll show you that in a moment. But that's the canonical thinking now of why fructose is bad. Now, what is interesting to note is that if you are eating fruit, or if you're not eating massive amounts of fructose in fruit, I would actually not be a fan of any processed fructose, and I'll talk about that in a bit as well. The small intestine might be protective against this, and you might not actually be getting any significant amount of fructose going to the liver or causing any of the changes that people are so concerned about. You have to really be careful to look at how much fructose they're using in these animal models and whether this is actually causing a problem in humans. As Joshua Rabinowitz goes on to say, fructose may cause liver ATP depletion as KHK, ketohexokinase, fructokinase consumes ATP, or lipogenesis as fructose catabolism bypasses the key regulated step of glycolysis, phosphofructokinase, and thereby provides an uncontrolled source of triosis. Well, we find that low doses of fructose are 90% cleared in the small intestine, higher doses pass substantially to the liver. This reflects saturation of small intestinal fructose clearance. Based on this, we propose that the small intestine shields the liver from fructose, and excessive doses of fructose overwhelm the small intestine, spilling over to the liver where they cause toxicity. Liver or intestine-specific KHK, ketohexokinase knockout mice, would be a fascinating experiment. Now, they'll go on to talk about the fact that intestinal fructose clearance is enhanced by both prior fructose exposure and by feeding. So if you're eating fruit, your body can upregulate the enzymatic systems in the small intestine to really process this. Now, they say here, a key difference between the health effects of fiber-rich fruits, perhaps even solid sweets like cake, I would not agree with that, and juices, sodas, is the rate of intestinal fructose release. So I think that what we're seeing here is perhaps a mechanism of evolutionarily consistent consumption of fructose in fruit with all the other compounds that come with it, nitric oxide precursors, et cetera, honey with nitric oxide precursors, and here we go. You guys are going to love this. Maybe this is a benefit of fiber. If you're going to eat fructose, you might as well eat it in fruit with a little bit of fiber. Maybe that slows down the absorption, allows the small intestine to do it more. In general, if you guys have followed me for any amount of time, you know that I'm not a fiber snob. I'm not a fiber zealot. I don't believe that fiber is the end all and be all for a variety of reasons. If you're getting some fiber in fruit, I don't think that's horrible for you, but I'm not one of these guys that believes you need more fiber, more fiber, more fiber. People sometimes ask me, how do you get enough fiber without vegetables? And I say, I don't think you need more fiber than what is in fruit. Honestly, I actually think there's a lot of good evidence that humans don't really need much fiber at all. But in the case of fructose, fiber may be beneficial. Maybe the fruit and fiber is somehow playing into this role in the small intestine. Regardless, the take-home message here is that it's pretty darn clear that moderate amounts of fructose, even eating multiple pieces of fruit in a meal, the Joshua Rabinowitz study suggests that we are looking at 1 gram per kilogram of fructose in a meal, 70 grams of fructose in a meal for a 70 kilogram adult. That's a lot of fructose. And that is going to give your small intestine the ability to process this fructose that's not going to arrive in the liver. That's great. That's probably what's going on in my physiology and your physiology if you're eating an animal-based diet. Now, let's return to the orangutans. They're eating 100% of their diet, 8,500 calories from fruit. Even if the physiology is equivalent, which it may be if they're a primate on some sort of a similar evolutionary latitude or evolutionary lineage from humans, but 8,500 calories from 100% fructose, okay, in that case, you're probably getting some fructose going to the liver, and perhaps it is leading to, even from fruit, problems with excess consumption of ATP, leading to ADP, excess AMP, perhaps even increasing uric acid and leading to problems. It would be interesting to look at those orangutans, see if their uric acid goes up when they're eating all that fruit. But if there are any animal-based people out there eating 8,500 calories of pure fruit, then you need to call me and talk to me because you're not eating an animal-based diet, because you're not eating anything but fruit. And the other piece that I think of that's kind of interesting is when I think about fruitarians, these are vegetarian vegans who only eat fruit, they often get very skinny. This is probably due to protein malnutrition and inadequate amino acids. And it would be interesting to look at their liver and see if they're getting very skinny or sarcopenic, loss of muscle mass with increasing fatty liver. That would be fascinating because these guys are definitely probably passing that 1 gram per kilogram threshold for fructose. And I want to be clear that I'm going to differentiate processed sugar from these fruit sugars. And the mechanism may actually be that the fructose in fruits is connected with fiber, is connected with these other compounds that affect fructose metabolism. We know that certain amino acids can rescue insulin resistance in animals that is caused by fructose. So I think that there is a role for these excess compounds, and I'll touch on that in a moment, these compounds that come with fructose in these foods. And as we've seen in the past, as I've shown in the podcast multiple times, honey, when it's raw, when it's not processed, when it's actual real honey as opposed to amber-colored high fructose corn syrup, can behave very differently in the human body, possibly because of maybe the way it's bound in the honey. We know that honey has prebiotics. Perhaps the fructose even in the honey is getting released more slowly. And there are nitric oxide precursors in honey. So there's something different about fruit. I would not recommend going anywhere near any processed sugar at all, probably because when you're processing the sugar, it's going to get released so much more quickly into that small intestine, overrun the mechanism, and go straight to the liver and cause problems. So there is a real difference between a soda and honey, between a soda and a banana, between a soda and table sugar. Well, those are actually pretty similar, but I was just doing that to see if you were paying attention. But there's a lot of people on Twitter, which I don't go on much anymore, who will say that a couple of tablespoons of honey is the same as a Coca-Cola. And that's just not the case. We really must debate. We really must get back against calories in, calories out zealotry. We must push back against the notion that all calories are created equal. We know from studies of seed oils that seed oils, linoleic acid containing oils, are going to affect human physiology much differently than oils like tallow, which contains stearic acid and other odd-chain fatty acids. So all calories are not created equally in the realm of fats. All calories are not created equally in the realm of carbohydrates. A processed sugar, high fructose corn syrup. I believe there's some debate whether the glucose and fructose, which make up high fructose corn syrup, are actually together or separate. Sucrose is table sugar. That is a disaccharide of glucose and fructose together. And perhaps in high fructose corn syrup, there is some separation of those. But there is an increasing trend toward looking like the sugar in these foods, perhaps even sucrose, processed sucrose, is getting absorbed so much more quickly into the body that could be a real problem. So perhaps that's part of the mechanisms, perhaps is the fact that the sugar is coming with all these other compounds that are affecting the way that we metabolize the fructose. But what is increasingly clear is that fructose from fruit is not that bad for humans at all. In fact, might be part of a very healthy diet, like an animal-based diet, as I would argue. And there are good studies to show this. I'm going to show you a study that Rick Johnson has done specifically in his clinic, looking at a low fructose diet where they added back fruit and didn't see any problems. But we wouldn't be surprised at that. We've seen it so often clinically in people with animal-based diets. Before I get into the study with Rick Johnson and fructose added back to a low fructose diet, I want to talk for a moment about vegetables. I don't know how many new people we have listening to the podcast, but people are probably asking, Paul, why even eat fruit? Why not get my carbohydrates from white potatoes or rice or oats or wheat? Leaves, stems, roots, and seeds of plants are the most highly defended parts of plants. When I was strict carnivore and I had these electrolyte issues, I had to think about this in my mind. I had to think, what carbohydrates should I add back? Should I add back dextrose? Should I add back maple syrup? Should I add back honey, which was the first thing I tried? Should I add back strawberries or oranges or bananas? That was the next thing I tried. Should I add back squash? Should I add back sweet potatoes? Should I add back white potatoes or rice? But as I got into the grains, things like rice, wheat, corn, and I got into the roots, things like white potatoes, I was immediately reminded of all the research that I'd done showing that many of those compounds have lots of defense chemicals. White potatoes are full of defense chemicals. They're full of solanine and other alkaloids, which are problematic for humans very clearly. They also contain lectins. I think white potatoes are going to cause massive issues for humans. Why would you get your carbohydrates from that when you could get your carbohydrates from the least toxic sources, which I believe are fruit? There's good evidence in tomatoes and other fruit, yes, tomatoes are fruit, that as fruit ripens, the amount of anti-nutrients, the amount of defense chemicals in the fruit decreases. So how fascinating is this? Plants are so smart. I've heard my friend Joe Rogan talk about this, and I've talked about it on the podcast. Some plants can actually sense vibrations of nearby insects chewing on leaves and increase the amount of defense chemicals in those leaves in anticipation of an insect coming to that leaf. Plants decrease the amount of defense chemicals in fruit as it ripens because they don't want an animal to eat the fruit before it's ripe. Because when the fruit is ripe, the seeds are ready inside. The plant is putting a lot of energy into that fruit to prepare those seeds to germinate. If the animal eats the fruit too soon, the seeds are not ready to germinate, meaning that if the animal consumes the fruit, then it's going to hopefully not chew all the seeds, poop out some of the seeds in a pile of fertilizer, but the seeds aren't ready to germinate. So all that effort by the plant is wasted. The intention of plants is very, very clear here. They're making sweet fruit. It is very palatable. It becomes more sweet as it's ripening, and it becomes more colorful as it's ripening to signal. I have bananas in my yard here in Costa Rica. They're green. They don't look good to me, but I know that maybe in a few months, when those suckers turn yellow, it is time to eat those bananas because that banana palm is ready to tell me, hey, these bananas are ready to be eaten, Paul. But right now, if I go eat those green bananas, not a good thing. They're going to taste mealy. I'm sure there's going to be more defense chemicals. We know that in the skin of the banana, there's a lot of saponins. And I think even in an unripe banana, you're going to find more defense chemicals from the plant. They're so smart the way they interact with us. But this happens in all plant parts. They don't decrease in leaves. Plants put defense chemicals in leaves like kale or spinach. They put defense chemicals in roots and stems and bark. Even cinnamon, a mainstream spice, has things like coumarins in it, which can be problematic for humans. Why would tree bark be good for us, guys? Plants don't want you to eat that. So just think about these things. Seeds are seeds, nuts, grains, and beans. These are all things that if you plant in the ground, they will grow into a plant. They're going to be the most highly defended part of the plant. They're net very, very negative. It's not to say that you can't find one study showing that if you include beans, maybe you have a positive outcome because it's displacing something else. But why would you eat the foods of survival? Why would you eat the foods that really only starving humans eat if you have access to much better foods, much more nutrient rich, much more bioavailable, much less toxic foods? So in my mind, as I'm thinking, which carbohydrates should I add back? Because I've learned in my journeys, in my evolution, in my continuous learning as a human, as a doctor, as a person, as a human being, that I needed carbohydrates, that I feel better with carbohydrates. Ketogenesis has benefits in some humans. I mentioned that I would talk about low carb diets, and I will before this podcast is over. But what carbohydrates should I add back? What carbohydrates do I think you should add in? Fruit and honey. The honey should be raw. It should be dark. It should not be heated. The fruit should be real fruit. It should not be pasteurized fruit juice. It should be real fruit. You want to make orange juice? Make it fresh squeezed. I think it's probably fine. Apple juice? No bueno. And don't pasteurize the fruit juice. And don't remove the pulp from the orange juice. And don't get pasteurized orange juice. really, I would just prefer pure fruit rather than fruit juice. But I think that even an orange juice with a pulp in it is probably fine. Maybe don't exceed 1 gram per kilogram of fructose in a certain setting. Don't chug a whole liter of orange juice. Or if you do, make sure you follow your labs and see if that has an experiment, see if that has an increase in anything that's negative, and tell me about the experiment, because we're still trying to figure this out as humans. But I don't think that we should fear fruit because it's an evolutionarily consistent food. And when we look into the data, there's so much good evidence that it's a great way to add carbohydrates for humans. And believe me, your gut, your partner, your toilet will thank you when you have less gas and bloating and you get to do one nice, dainty, polite poop a day instead of 3 smelly, farty poops from vegetables. And if you look at the poop, which is kind of gross, but an interesting experiment, I know you've done it, we've all done it, you'll see a lot of undigested vegetable parts when you're eating those things, but you won't see a lot of undigested fruit parts. Fruit is very digestible, as is meat. So don't ever fall prey to the notion that meat is rotting or putrefying in your stomach. That is also bullshit. So let's take a look at one of Ric's studies, which gets mentioned briefly in the podcast, but I think should have probably gotten more focus because it's so fascinating. The effect of 2 energy-restricted diets, a low fructose diet versus a moderate natural fructose diet on weight loss and metabolic syndrome parameters, a randomized controlled trial. This one is not observational. This is randomized and controlled. And you'll see here, at the end of the study, what they found was that weight loss was higher in the moderate natural fructose group than the low fructose group. Interesting. Compared with baseline, each intervention diet was associated with significant improvement in secondary outcomes. Reduction of energy and added fructose intake may represent an important therapeutic target to reduce frequency of obesity and diabetes. For weight loss achievement, an energy-restricted moderate natural fructose diet was superior to a low fructose diet. So, comments on the study. All the groups had energy restriction. All groups were energy restricted. So not surprisingly, all groups saw improvement in secondary measures. We know that basically if you restrict someone's calories, if you do intermittent fasting or fasting, you can feed them Twinkies and you'll see improvements in insulin sensitivity. Is it a good long-term diet? No. But what's important here to note is that a moderate, real natural fructose diet actually resulted in more weight loss than a very low fructose restricted diet. If fructose is truly invariably causing weight gain because of a uricase mutation from an evolutionary ape, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment if you guys aren't familiar with that theory, then why would a moderate fructose diet cause more weight loss than a low fructose diet? That doesn't make any sense, right? And I think we see this in humans, including some fruit, often leads to improved weight loss. But let's go further into the study because I want to show you a few more pieces here that are quite fascinating. So if you scroll down in the study, I wanted to see what happened to the participants' uric acid. So this is within and between group changes in the low fructose group and the moderate fructose group with natural fruit supplementation. Here's uric acid. Low fructose group went down by minus 0.24. And they said that the moderate natural fructose group got minus 0.22. There was really no difference between these two groups. So the moderate natural fructose group that included fruit in their diet had the uric acid decline by as much as the low fructose group. Tell me again that the fruit with fructose is problematic for humans. Doesn't look like it in this interventional trial with humans. And you can see here also insulin resistance score, which is the HOMA-IR, which is calculated with fasting insulin and fasting blood glucose, declined actually more in the natural moderate fructose group, minus 0.37 versus minus 0.29 in the intervention group with low fructose. The comparison between groups did not reach significance. The p-value was 0.12, so we can't say anything clearly there. But there was a trend toward even more reduction in the insulin resistance, including natural fructose. Okay, quite interesting. And here we can look at the triglycerides as well. Triglycerides declined equally in both groups. Well, I should say they declined in both groups, again, with a trend toward more reduction in triglycerides with moderate natural food intake. Okay, HDL. HDL actually increased in the moderate natural fructose group and decreased in the other one. The trend was toward improvement in the moderate natural fructose group. Again, didn't reach statistical significance between the two of them. We see all of these trends in these groups, and it's really striking to notice that there was a real difference here. And actually, as I mentioned in the abstract, what did reach statistical significance were the changes in BMI between the two groups, with a moderate natural fructose group losing more on BMI, losing more weight when they included some natural fruits. So we just must be very careful not to demonize fruit and assume that fructose in fruit is so bad for us when it's an evolutionarily prized thing. I know you guys will be asking, how much fruit did they get? And I want to show you in this study one time, this moderate fructose group had not a small amount of fruit in their diet. As you can see here, the low fructose diet group versus the moderate fructose diet group, they divided these up into 1,500, 1,800, and 2,000 calorie groups. All of them were calorie restricted. The low fructose group had 60 calories from fruit. The moderate fructose group had 480 calories from fruit. Over here, the 1,800 had 540 and the 2,000 had 540. So between 480 and 540 calories a day from fruit is not an insignificant amount of fruit. Remember that carbohydrates are 4 calories per gram. So you're looking at more than 100 you're looking at more than 100 grams of carbohydrates, 120 grams of carbohydrates from fruit in all of these groups. 120 grams of carbohydrates from fruit in the moderate fruit groups. And again, more weight loss, no loss of metabolic benefits, no loss of insulin, improvements in insulin sensitivity, no loss in BMI, in fact, more BMI loss. So this is a very fascinating interventional study that was head-to-head that showed, hey, if you restrict processed fructose, that it's great. And if you restrict processed fructose and you include 120 grams of carbohydrates from fruit a day, they still didn't lose any of the benefits. That's pretty significant. And it falls in line with what we saw from Joshua Rabinowitz's study. These people were certainly not exceeding 70, 50, 60 grams of fructose at any meal relative to their body weights. So fascinating stuff there, which really begins to challenge this nutritional reductionism. That's what I'm all about, challenging nutritional reductionism. There's just one more piece of this discussion of fructose that I thought was interesting that I wanted to mention, and then we'll move on to talking about uric acid, because these often get connected. And again, uric acid gets dragged through the mud, I would say, unfairly as well, as we'll see. But this is the polyol pathway. This is something that I wasn't really aware of, so it was fun to research it. In this podcast with Peter, Rick mentions that there's an enzyme called aldose reductase, and this enzyme converts glucose to fructose through sorbitol. So sorbitol is probably not a good thing to get in any of your drinks because it's partway on this pathway and it's going to produce fructose. And at the level of the liver, that could be bad if it overwhelms the liver's capacity to deal with that fructose. I don't think you want sugar alcohols like sorbitol in your food. It's not a good substitute for sugar. You shouldn't be using things with processed sugar or sorbitol or sugar alcohols. But what Rick does bring up is the question of whether this enzyme is induced by metabolic dysfunction. And I think it probably is. That one of the mechanisms by which people who have diabetes and underlying metabolic dysfunction, aka insulin resistance, may be converting glucose to fructose in the human body and causing stress on their liver. This may be a mechanism for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease of hyperglycemia, is through this enzyme, aldose reductase. Now, this is quite fascinating. And one of the more interesting pieces is the idea that as we're young, as kids, maybe these college athletes, we see them, they look like specimens of health and they're eating all junk food and all soda. But as we age, things start to fall apart. So what's going on here? Well, the suggestion is that this polyol pathway gets more activated in the mitochondria because our mitochondria are aging. What is aging our mitochondria? Could it possibly be a substance that is ubiquitous in our diet that accumulates in our cell membranes and changes the way that our mitochondria function? I think it could be. So the hypothesis that I would add to this is are seed oils, is excess linoleic acid, which is accumulating in your body when you eat seed oils, contributing to mitochondrial dysfunction by becoming more of a population of both your cell membrane and your mitochondrial membrane. Cardiolipin in the mitochondrial membrane will contain linoleic acid when it's enriched in your diet, and that leading to problems with mitochondrial metabolism, leading to increases in aldose reductase, leading to increased conversion of glucose to fructose, leading to NAFLD when you eat processed carbohydrates or almost any carbohydrates as an insulin-resistant individual. That to me is fascinating. The very important take-home point is this. Humans are very unique in our biochemistry. We almost have a gas tank for linoleic acid, but not in a good way. Meaning, the more seed oils you put on your skin, the more seed oils you put in your mouth, the more seed oils you're going to find in your membranes. And by seed oils, I mean things like linoleic acid, an 18-carbon omega-6 fatty acid. That is a big problem because you are accumulating those. We can look at the adipose tissue of humans and tell how much linoleic acid they've been eating because the adipose tissue stores linoleic acid. It stores, it's a history book. You can get rid of it when you decrease your linoleic acid gradually. But if you are eating consistent amounts of linoleic acid, I can look at your fat. I can look at the cell membranes of your body and tell you how much linoleic acid you've been eating. And that's a bad thing. You are accumulating linoleic acid in corn, canola, safflower, sunflower, grapeseed, soybean oils. Major problem. You can also accumulate linoleic acid from chicken or pork that is fed corn and soy if their fat is enriched in linoleic acid, which is why I'm a fan of eating a low linoleic acid diet. That's why I'm such a fan of red meat fat, tallow, etc., high in stearic acid, high in odd-chain fatty acids, and low in linoleic acid. I've done many podcasts on this. You can refer to the recent one I did with Nick Baer, who interviewed me on seed oils. It's on my same podcast here, Fundamental Health, if you want more on the seed oil conversation. But I do have some concerns. And I think there's a real interesting possibility here that as we age, as we eat more junk food, which is often a combination of seed oils and processed sugars, the magically horrible things in our body, that seed oil is going to lead to increased linoleic acid in our mitochondrial membranes and our cell membranes. That is going to lead to many problems with our physiology, could increase the polyol pathway in aldose reductase and convert more glucose in your blood into fructose. Ultimately, that enzyme appears to be triggered by changes in hyperosmolarity as well. So there's a lot there to dig into. But if you see kids who can eat anything and not get diabetic and not get fatty liver, well, a lot of kids are getting diabetic and fatty liver earlier, but there's something going on probably with the mitochondria. And at some point, those mitochondria just give up. They pass out on the beach and they just start doing things badly. And that could be a difference in the physiology between those ages of humans, but we don't want that aldose reductase pathway. And it's important to know that the human body can make excess fructose from glucose if you are hyperglycemic, which is something that happens in the setting of diabetes. One of the questions I get is, Paul, is it okay to eat an animal-based diet if I am already diabetic? And I think the answer is yes, I do. I don't think a lot of carbohydrates are going to be great for you. I would probably keep your fruit intake to less than mine. I don't think I would eat 150 to 200 grams of carbohydrates like I do from fruit and honey a day if you're diabetic, but I think it's okay to get some. In the past, I've actually shown studies where they gave honey to diabetics and their insulin sensitivity improved. Their blood sugars went up, but their insulin sensitivity got better with honey. So I don't think honey is pushing you in the wrong direction. Getting blood sugar spikes might not be a great thing based on what I discussed earlier because your glucose might spike. You might have a lot of aldose reductase. You can convert it to fructose. So I think in general, trending toward lower carbohydrates is better if you're already sick. If you're already diabetic, I would decrease those things. If you're metabolically healthy, you can eat fructose. You can eat fruit. You can eat honey. I would never eat sugar. I would never eat processed sugar. I would never eat soda. I would always know that those are the major problem. They're often added to things, and I would never eat seed oils. If you're diabetic, if you're pre-diabetic, if you're obese, do lower carbohydrate. Do 75, 100 grams of carbohydrates a day. See how you do. Check your A1C. Check your fasting insulin. Check your fasting glucose. Wear a continuous glucose monitor. Do all of those things and monitor. But I think that lower carbohydrate diets could be better for these people because there may be a propensity to convert this excess glucose into fructose, and it can be problematic. It's healable, though. Remember this. The mainstream pharmaceutical narrative, and I hate to sound conspiratorial like that, is really that you can't fix diabetes. You can't fix your autoimmune disease. You can't fix your chronic disease. And I think that is, well, bullshit. So many of these things are healable. They are fixable. They are reversible when we return to an evolutionarily consistent state. This is more of a naturopathic perspective. I almost went to naturopathic medical school. As most of you know, I went to allopathic medical school. I have an MD from the University of Arizona, and I did residency at the University of Washington. So I did allopathic mainstream medical school, but my thinking is more in line with naturopathy in the sense that I think that if we remove the impediments, the body will heal itself. And to that, I would add, if you remove the impediments, in this case, perhaps processed sugar, seed oils, toxin-containing vegetables, which is a very controversial opinion that I hold, and you give your body the nutrients it needs with organs, meat, fruit, honey, and raw dairy, in that case, your body will heal itself. So do not become despondent. Do not believe that you cannot heal yourself with diet and lifestyle if you live evolutionarily. That's what optimal health is all about. That's what I'm about. That's what I want to communicate to all of you, that with movement, with nature, with proper sunlight, and with nourishment properly, you can heal and reverse your illnesses. That's why I do this podcast. That's why I'm excited to do everything I do. So with all of that said, Hopefully, much of that makes sense. Let's talk about uric acid and then wrap this baby up. There recently have been books published. Much of the conversation between Rick and Peter talks about the problems with uric acid. So I want to go into this. And again, let's start from the beginning and say this. Does eating fruit and honey raise your uric acid? If my labs, if the people that I've worked with, labs are any indication, if people that I've seen on Instagram who send me their labs, I don't give medical advice, is any indication, no, it will not. What organ meats? Will those increase your uric acid? Not if you are insulin sensitive. The paradigm around uric acid is much too simple. I've done a whole podcast on gout and why organs, meat, and fruit do not cause gout if you are insulin sensitive. The problem is that people are eating organs, meat, and fruit, and they're insulin resistant, and that's a problem. But what made them insulin resistant were none of those things. It was processed sugars and seed oils. People often look to historical references of nobility or royalty saying, look, they had gout. This is a disease of the royalty. Well, as Rick points out, there's very good evidence that alcohol consumption was common along with fruit, but I don't think fruit was causing their gout, and that to the alcohol, much sugar was added. So we cannot blame gout in any king of England on fruit when that person is also consuming alcohol, which we know that ethanol is metabolized much like fructose. It goes straight to the liver. There's no brakes. There's no protective mechanisms like there are with fruit. And that sugar is added to that alcohol. Sugar's been around for a very long time, guys. So do not be fooled by those historical accounts either. So let's look at Paul Saladino, Carnivore MD's uric acid and get a sense of where I have been in the past. It's about time for me to get new blood work, so I'll do a whole panel and repeat this, but I want to show you guys the full history. This one is from 2019, July of 2019. At this point, I was strictly carnivore, and you can see a couple of things from this blood work. My uric acid was 4.6 milligrams per deciliter. Units will be important later when we look at uric acid and oxidative stress. And I also want to point out that my fasting insulin was 3, my C-peptide was 1.0, and my vitamin E was very high. It's actually at the high end of normal. Sometimes people criticize a strictly carnivore diet, say there's not enough vitamin E. Well, I wasn't supplementing with vitamin E, and my vitamin E was very high. My coenzyme Q10 was off the charts, 2.38. My homocysteine was 7. My 25-hydroxy with vitamin D was 44. I was living in San Diego at the time, probably could have been better. But this is old blood work from more than a few years ago. You can see here my ferritin is 220. I don't worry about that because I don't have hemochromatosis, nor do I have any evidence of oxidative stress connected with that. That's a whole separate podcast. My fasting glucose was 90 on a zero-carb diet, and my fructosamine was 234. So more recently, a little over a year ago, I had blood work done, and my uric acid was 3.9. What was different between the two of those things? For the second uric acid, which was lower, I had added fruit and honey. So there are so many examples of this. It is really not the case that fruit and honey will cause uric acid to rise. And I'm eating lots of organs in both of those situations. Let's be very, very clear. And I've seen this over and over. So in many of the recent books that have been published, or the recent book that's been published about uric acid, the recommendations are to limit organ meats. This is the worst idea ever. You will become nutrient deficient and you're missing out on a very, very critical nutrient source. That's why I built Heart and Soil, because a lot of you guys won't eat fresh raw organs. So you can check us out, heartandsoil.co. If you need desiccated organs, we make the best ones on the planet, grass-fed, grass-finished, regeneratively raised, et cetera, et cetera. If you can get raw organs, freaking fist bump to you, amazing, do that and thrive. Do not worry about your uric acid. You can do this experiment yourself. Go test your uric acid, and you'll see that when you're insulin sensitive, your uric acid will not rise. It is not as simple as organs and meat cause your uric acid to rise. In the setting of insulin resistance, perhaps purine metabolism is disordered. Now, where does uric acid come from? If you decrease purine consumption in an adult male, you can decrease uric acid about 35%. Now, this is presumably a male that's somewhat insulin resistant, because I don't think that you could decrease my uric acid much, or if you could, I don't know that I would want to decrease my uric acid much. It's already at the low end of normal. But that would suggest that 60 to 70% of uric acid is made endogenously from the breakdown of purines from DNA, et cetera. So maybe a third comes from our diet. But I don't think that, and there's good evidence for this in the gout podcast that I've already done, I show it, There's good evidence that if you increase the amount of meat and organs, the body can auto-regulate the amount of uric acid and it will not rise. But I think that in the setting of insulin resistance, kidney mechanisms for this get impaired. And this is, again, the problem, that people conflate these things massively. So why all this hub about uric acid? Well, there's reasonable evidence that in individuals, in humans, and in cell culture models, and in animal models, high levels of uric acid are problematic for humans. But not levels of uric acid like I have, 3.9, 4.6, levels of 7, 6, even 8, 9, 10. Those levels become problematic. At levels that are physiologic, I don't think uric acid is a horrible thing. And I definitely, as I said, I will repeat this one more time, uric acid will not be increased by eating organs and meat if you are metabolically healthy. You know how to get there because you listen to this podcast. In the nutrition space now, there are assertions that uric acid causes reactive oxygen species to increase in mitochondria, oxidative stress to increase in mitochondria. But those are not often, in my opinion, adequately framed in terms of how much uric acid we're talking about. So this is a cell culture study looking at hepatocytes, and they looked at different levels of uric acid to see how much oxidative stress they could cause for DNA damage. And what you find here is they're going from 0, 5, 10, 20, and 30. Really, the significant differences happened beyond 10 milligrams per deciliter. Well, remember, my uric acid is 3.9 milligrams per deciliter. It's not even physiologic. I don't think many humans could achieve 10. Now, 10 is achievable by some in massive levels of uric acid in the human body, in the blood, or in the urine, which would be hyperuricemia. But the majority of people are not going to get uric acid to 10 unless you're really, really insulin resistant. I don't know if there's ever been a documented case of somebody having uric acid of 30 milligrams per deciliter, but that's what they say in the study, that if you increase uric acid to 30 milligrams per deciliter, you see massive reactive oxygen species. Okay, that's fine, but I don't think that's really a physiologic dose of this compound. And it's certainly not a level of uric acid that humans are going to achieve eating an animal-based diet. There are some who increasingly believe that the loss of the uricase mutation in humans, which is an enzyme that breaks down uric acid, was connected with our propensity to develop body fat and survival. I'm not completely convinced by this theory for a number of reasons. If you want to generate more uric acid in the human body, not only do you have to lose the uricase mutation, you have to have many changes in the kidney physiology to retain the uric acid because we're not peeing it out. So you have to reabsorb it, which is something that humans actively do. So the other side of this equation is that uric acid may have many beneficial roles in the human body when someone is not insulin resistant. Imagine that. We've seen this many times, like LDL cholesterol, for instance, which gets demonized again and again. I can't help but think that uric acid is just LDL all over again. It's nutritional reductionism. It's missing context, and it's blaming the firemen when there was actually a different arsonist. I don't think uric acid is causing a lot of these problems. Perhaps it is when it gets massively elevated, but I don't think it's the uric acid itself that's causing the uric acid to get elevated. I think it's something else, the insulin resistance, that's driving that. And I don't think that it's a direct correlation between meat and purines and organs and purines in the human diet, or fructose from fruit in the human diet. And this is what I'm driving at. But I don't think those things are raising uric acid, and it's just nutritional reductionism all over again. There are actually some pretty darn interesting studies that suggest that uric acid might be beneficial in many ways. There's a study that I've referenced many times in the past that looks at both uric acid and glutathione levels in cold water swimmers. And this one is very interesting because both uric acid and glutathione levels drop during short-term whole body cold exposure. So I have used this study to suggest that the human body, as we know, has many mechanisms which are endogenous for making antioxidants. Glutathione is by far the largest antioxidant. But I think that contrary to those who would poo-poo this notion, yes, I said poo-poo or doo-doo, there's a good amount of evidence that uric acid in healthy human physiology could actually be acting as an antioxidant. And I think that's very interesting. So you see that glutathione levels will decrease, both oxidized and reduced with acute cold exposure, and then they go up the next day. And so that's quite interesting that glutathione is being consumed, which is the fact that cold exposure causes oxidative stress. Heat exposure causes oxidative stress. Your body's going to consume glutathione, and uric acid goes down and then bumps up the next day. So where's the uric acid going? So there's a lot of good hypotheses around the idea that uric acid can elevate in conditions that are going to cause more oxidative stress. And that may be the reason that uric acid is going up in things like alcohol or other exposures that are going to increase reactive oxygen species. Perhaps it's actually a beneficial thing in some ways. Again, think about the context, think about the overall metabolic health, but uric acid is decreasing. There's a decreased level of uric acid in individuals when they're exposed to cold water. So again, this is quite fascinating. Could both uric acid and glutathione be antioxidant mechanisms, be mechanisms by which the body is managing reactive oxygen species, which occur in things like cold and hot? All of this to the point that maybe uric acid isn't completely bad. Another thing that's interesting is that uric acid secretion from adipose tissue does increase in obesity. There's an enzyme, xanthine oxidoreductase, which is produced in the adipose tissue and can increase uric acid. So the results of this study, the title is Uric Acid Secretion from the Adipose Tissue and its Increase in Obesity. Our results suggest that purine catabolism in adipose tissue could be enhanced in obesity. So maybe uric acid is going up in obesity because the adipose tissue is breaking it down. But then it begs the question, why are people becoming obese and insulin resistant in the first place? Is this part of the whole breaking the fat cell equation that happens when you overload these fat cells with seed oils? Does the uric acid metabolism get disordered? Is all of this wrapped in together? Is uric acid really the bad guy? Or is uric acid just the product of a deeper pathology, a deeper physiologic derangement that is driven by other things, namely processed sugars and seed oils? I don't think uric acid is really the bad guy entirely here. There's a little bit older paper. There's a little bit older paper from Bruce Ames that I'll show here. It's from 1981. Uric acid provides an antioxidant defense in humans against oxidant and radical-causing aging and cancer. This is a hypothesis, but I think there's a lot of compelling points. They say, we show that at physiologic concentrations, urate, which is uric acid, reduces the oxoheme oxidant formed by peroxide reaction with hemoglobin, protects erythrocyte ghosts, which I believe are just empty red blood cells, against lipid peroxidation, and protects erythrocytes from peroxidative damage, leading to lysis. They go on to say, the plasma urate level in humans is considerably higher than the ascorbate level, which is vitamin C, making it one of the major antioxidants to humans. I think this is quite fascinating to suggest that there may be mechanisms by which uric acid is actually, there may be mechanisms by which uric acid could be a beneficial thing for humans, and perhaps that uricase mutation was not there to get us fat, because our small intestines, as we evolved as humans, are much more able to manage the amount of fructose that's coming into our bodies. Perhaps it's there, or perhaps it serves another role to help us with an antioxidant and allow less oxidative stress, which leads to a lengthened lifespan. You know what else leads to a lengthened lifespan? Meat and organs, at least based on the observational study, possibly, that we looked at in the beginning of the study. And you know how to increase your glutathione? Well, get the amino acids present in meat, things like cysteine, glycine, glutamine, which are essential for glutathione, and B vitamins like B6, which are uniquely represented and much more bioavailable in red meat. So if you really want to protect yourself from oxidative stress, eat red meat and organs. Another thing that's fascinating is that a transport system has been described. It transports urate or hypoxanthine into human erythrocytes. Those are red blood cells. This may ensure the availability of urate at intracellular sites. Why would our body transport uric acid into the cell if it's always a bad thing? Is it possibly doing things like scavenging single oxygen, scavenging hydroxyl radicals, scavenging other reactive oxygen species? I think it's quite possible. Again, this is just hypothesis, but I find it to be very interesting. And they go on to say increased urate levels in response to oxidative stress. They say the mechanism of this increase is thought to be marked inhibition of renal clearance of urate by the lactate and beta hydroxybutyrate that accumulate during exercise. They're mentioning that uric acid goes up with exercise. Okay, maybe it's not a bad thing. Uric acid also goes up when you fast. And they say lead exposure, high alcohol ingestion, and obesity are all associated with increased urate levels in man. Because each of these has been associated with lipid peroxidation, there may be a causal connection. Maybe the uric acid is going up as a protective role. I just find all of this quite interesting. I just find all of this quite interesting and fascinating. And I think it's important to know who the real villain. I think it's important to know who the real villain here is. I don't think it's uric acid necessarily. If you guys are curious how high uric acid can go during fasting, this is the longest fast recorded in the case reports. This guy's pretty famous. 382 days. Patient AB. He weighed 456 pounds at admission. during 382 days of his fast. Vitamin supplements were given, etc. And he lost a significant amount of weight. I forget how much, something like, I don't know, like hundreds of pounds in that amount of time. But you can see here his uric acid was bumping between 10 and maybe up to even 17. So levels that we saw in cell culture that could cause significant mitochondrial stress or reactive oxygen species, but his labs look normal. So is there something else going on here with metabolic health that is mitigating this level of uric acid? Is there a milieu here? Is there a context that we need to think about? Look at this. His blood glucose just went down and down and down. He got more healthy. He got more insulin sensitive as his uric acid is massively high. So where is, in this case, the uric acid causing major issues for this human as his overall physiology just improves with weight loss? Very interesting. Probably the uric acid is rising and staying up because he's getting breakdown of massive fat tissue and all of these nuclei and DNA and all these things are being recycled. So it's increasing uric acid, but he's also quite insulin sensitive. So I don't think that uric acid is unanimously invariably harmful for humans. Obviously, context matters. And what is the most important context? The most important context is how insulin sensitive you are. So in summary, in grand summary, the most important things to cut out of your diet are processed sugars. We've seen that they behave differently in humans than fruit, and seed oils. Corn, canola, safflower, sunflower, they're in everything. I'm living in Costa Rica now, and I was at a grocery store the other day filming a reel for Instagram. And I thought, wow, I haven't been in a mainstream grocery store. Usually I go to kind of a health foodie, hippie grocery store. But in this mainstream grocery store, I thought, like 70% of what's in here has processed sugar and seed oils. No wonder our population is so freaking unhealthy. And it's super sad. You actually really have to try hard to avoid processed sugar and seed oils. If you just fumble your way through a grocery store, you are going to get bombarded with these foods. I don't think this is rocket science in any way, shape, or form. The first two things to cut out of your diet are seed oils, number one, processed sugars, number two. They're really both number one. They're tied for the first spot. Do those things and do nothing else, and your health will improve. If you really want to kick ass, if you really want optimal health, do not fear organs or meat because they might raise uric acid. I've shown in multiple ways this will not happen if you are metabolically healthy. Refer back to the gout podcast if you have more questions about that. The notion that these will raise uric acid is myopia, and the people who are suggesting this have not reviewed all the literature, and I would love to debate them in the future. Hopefully we can make that happen because they are, in my strong opinion, wrong, and the exclusion of organ meats in the human diet will lead to much lost optimal health, much lost vitality, and much lost opportunity. Organs are important. So do not fear organs. Do not fear meat. Do not fear fruit. The study from Rick Johnson clearly shows that 120 grams of carbohydrates from fruit a day did not mitigate or did not abrogate any of the benefits from a low processed fructose diet. So how is fruit bad for humans? Do not fear raw honey. I've shown you many studies in the past suggesting that's very different than sugar. It's not the same as a Coca-Cola. Those are very different. And don't fear things like raw dairy or getting in the sun or being in nature or grounding or playing or having adventures. I think this is what we're supposed to do as humans. We know this intrinsically. Imagine yourself out in the forest. What are you going to seek with your tribe? You're going to hunt animals. You're going to eat them nose to tail. If you see a ripe piece of fruit, you're definitely eating that. If you get a beehive, you're going to go eat that like Liver King and I did in Africa with the Hadza. No question. And the science supports it and the blood work supports it and everything comes in line mostly. You guys can refer back to the previous podcast I've done on LDL. Often LDL rises. I don't worry about that in the setting of metabolic health as well. That paradigm needs to change in general. But even under the accepted paradigms, we see low uric acid in people who are eating an animal-based diet, like me, eating lots of meat and organs and lots of fruit and lots of honey. We see low insulin. We see low C-peptide. We see low fasting glucose, low HOMA-IR, low inflammation. It's all there. Even in the mainstream paradigm, this is not the way that this performs in humans. These ideas, these notions that meat and organs will raise uric acid are antiquated. They're anachronisms. They need to go, and they're hurting people. I believe it deeply. All right, guys, that is it for today's podcast. Hopefully I was able to connect a few dots and show a few of those interesting studies. And remember that 1 gram of fructose per kilogram of body weight is probably metabolizing your small intestine and your liver's protected. And anyway, I'll go further down the rabbit hole if you guys want in the future. Hopefully this is helpful. I love you all. Claim your birthright to optimal health. It's yours. Do it. You know how to do it.